we're going to move on to the next one, which is what can the president do if the trust fund is exhausted? I'm glad it's an if, not a when, but we'll see if that's true. We have Andrew and Kristen to talk on this, so go ahead.
Thank you. I'll start us off. Thank you to Greg, Jailu, and Sherry for organizing this event and for letting a lawyer crash this economic forum. So we're here, Andrew and I are going to talk about the future of security, Social Security, and particularly the future if Congress doesn't reform before 2033. This raises economic questions that are outside my area of expertise as a lawyer, but because Social Security is a legal program, it does generate some questions for the lawyers, the answers to which have profound economic implications. So just to provide some background in my kind of experience with this topic, when I worked for the Department of Justice, I spent a fair amount of time thinking about the president's authority when we hit the statutory debt limit and the flexibility that the president might have, for example, to keep paying interest on the debt and make debt service payments over, prioritizing that over other spending. And so while I am, by the way, not representing any official views of the Department of Justice or even of my current law firm here, I'm in my personal capacity, but that's what led me to think about this and actually reach out to Andrew about this Social Security, this legal theory that I have. And so we've been collaborating on what is conceptually a somewhat similar issue regarding Social Security, is what happens when the trust fund runs dry, what can the president do? And we put together, we've co-authored a working paper with the AEI that I encourage you all to check out. It fleshes this out in a little bit more detail. So there are a few caveats before I get into the nitty-gritty details. The first is we're only talking about old age and survivors insurance, not disability insurance here. So when I say Social Security, I mean OASI. And that OASI trust fund is projected to be depleted in 2033. At that point, incoming money from Social Security's dedicated taxes will be enough to cover estimated about 79% of benefits. So Andrew and I have been exploring what happens then, or really what can happen then, depending upon how the president at the time exercises their authority. We are assuming no changes to existing law, that there's, congressional reform efforts have fallen flat, and nothing. Congress has not done anything. Obviously, if there is a legal reform, that would very much change the ballgame, and this could be mooted. But we thought it was important to look at the question of what happens if there's no congressional reform, because, well, gosh, I was born in 1983. I have learned, from growing up about Social Security being insolvent. Now I am a middle-aged mom of four, and I'm closer to Social Security than I am from when I first learned that Social Security was going insolvent. Nothing has happened. And frankly, given how we talked about even the current presidential candidates and their promises, I don't think anyone expects Social Security reform to happen anytime soon. So we actually probably do need to start thinking about what happens if there's no reform. But second, even if there is a reform effort at some point between now and 2033, what is the status quo that we're talking about? What will happen provides a baseline for those reform discussions. And so we've identified sort of two pieces of conventional wisdom that I'll talk about today for Social Security, what happens in 2033. The first piece of conventional wisdom that everyone assumes is that Social Security spending has to be reduced by 21%. And really what I mean by that is that benefits have to be payable purely from incoming revenue, dedicated Social Security revenue, which estimates currently mean will cover 79%. This could be a little bit more, a little bit less, depending upon what the actual real predictions actually pan out. But I'll use 21% as a kind of a baseline here. The second piece of conventional wisdom is that everyone's Social Security benefits will have to be cut by the same percentage. That means whether you're Bill Gates or the poor widow living Social Security check to Social Security check, if you look through the news articles, everyone just assumes, even scholars, that they're both going to get a 21% cut. This would disproportionately impact the poorest and oldest retirees. Andrew has studied this issue and determined that it would double, perhaps, and maybe even more so, the poverty rate, and that even the middle class would be substantially impacted by an across-the-board cut. But fortunately, Andrew and I think that only the first piece of conventional wisdom is correct. So starting with that, that once we hit insolvency, Social Security spending does need to be reduced by 21%. Yes, I think that is correct. Although I will say the answer is a little bit more nuanced than most people might expect. So the answer to this question does involve some constitutional law, so bear with me for a moment. The Appropriations Clause of the U.S. Constitution provides, in no uncertain terms, that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So that means just because Congress has established a program like Social Security, if they have not specifically established an appropriation to fund it, Congress, the executive branch cannot send out those checks. Treasury can't cut it. There's also a statute, the Anti-Deficiency Act, that reinforces this, but the baseline is it's a constitutional requirement. So normally a lot of programs have annual appropriations bills. That's kind of discretionary spending. And that's why you see government shutdowns when the annual appropriations bills sometimes fail and we have a standoff. There are also permanent appropriations in some cases, including Social Security. Some appropriations are uncapped, and we'll actually talk about a permanent appropriation that's uncapped in a second. But some are limited by a specific number. Mostly those are annual. And some, like Social Security, are limited to the amounts from a dedicated revenue stream. So Social Security's, it's for the most part, it's payroll taxes. It's also taxes on Social Security benefits are the primary drivers. And so whatever the government collects from that dedicated revenue stream, it can spend no more in Social Security benefits. For a few years, or decades, Social Security, that revenue stream has been greater than the amount of benefits, leading to an accumulated surplus plus sitting in that appropriation. But by 2033, that surplus will be gone, meaning that we only have that dedicated revenue stream, the appropriation coming in. It would be unconstitutional to spend more than that dedicated revenue stream. And by the way, the president also can't unilaterally raise taxes. So that requires a congressional statute. So the president can't say, well, I'm going to, raise the Social Security payroll tax by 4% to cover this. Now, this is where I think it gets a little nuanced. There is a permanent appropriation for judgments against the United States. It's called the Judgment Fund. And there is a law professor, Matt Lawrence, who has studied Medicare bankruptcy and theorized that at least for the first year of Medicare bankruptcy, providers who submitted, provided care, could sue the government, obtain a judgment, and collect from the Judgment Fund, which is kind of an indirect way of getting a full payment under this program. And the Judgment Fund, by the way, is an unlimited appropriation. So it's just necessary amounts are appropriated to pay final judgments, essentially, against the United States. This raises the question, could Social Security beneficiaries sue the government after insolvency for full benefits and get a judgment that is payable from the Judgment Fund? Ultimately, I think the answer is no, not at all. This is both based upon my best view of the law as well as a predictive matter, because as a predictive matter, you look at it and you're like, this case is going to go up to the Supreme Court, and what Supreme Court is going to put the government on the hook for $350 billion a year on an ongoing basis. It's just not going to happen. But going back to the law, there are two legal requirements. The first is the Judgment Fund only is payable for money judgments or the functional equivalent. Which could be an injunction to pay a specified person a specified amount. The problem here is the statute, Social Security statute, only authorizes judgments essentially reviewing a decision of the Social Security Commissioner, not monetary judgments. And the Supreme Court also has this line of cases about money mandating situations where you could sue under the theory that this statute promises me money and therefore I want a money judgment against the United States. Most recently in Maine Community Health, the Risk Corridors case involving the Affordable Care Act. And even in that case, Justice Sotomayor's majority opinion was very careful to distinguish between attempts to compensate people for past injuries, statutes of that nature, as well as attempts to subsidize ongoing future state expenditures. And they said, we're very cautious and very reluctant to say an ongoing obligation is a money mandating situation. So I think that is the first hurdle for why the Judgment Fund isn't available here. The second one is the Judgment Fund is statutorily limited to paying awards that are not otherwise provided for by a different appropriation. Both the Government Accountability Office and the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel have long held that just because there are insufficient amounts in an appropriation doesn't mean that it's not legally available. You still have to look for that appropriation and you're stuck with it. That is a very clear and long-standing view of both GAO and OLC. The only hesitancy there is that I have not found, this is just a very rarely litigated situation, and I've not found a judicial decision addressing that aspect of the judgment fund. But long story short, while I do think the situation is actually somewhat nuanced because of the existence of the judgment fund, in short, the conventional wisdom is correct that if we hit insolvency, Social Security's overall spending does need to be reduced by 21%. There's one caveat to this, is that insolvency will not extinguish the underlying statutory entitlement to money. So if for whatever reason the fertility rate increased or, payroll taxes magically, we had an economic boom and we suddenly started having surpluses, then the government would have to pay out proportionally whatever extra it had to try to get as close to full benefits as possible. Turning to really what is the focus of mine and Andrew's paper. So forgive my kind of academic departure in the spirit of full disclosure of analyzing the situation. Conventional wisdom, the second part of conventional wisdom, that everyone's benefits must be reduced by the same percentage. Think that is wrong. This assumption pervades Social Security discussions, and it's even assumed by the trustees in their actuarial reports. Andrew's actually cited himself in our working paper as someone who has also made this assumption, albeit with a footnote, I think, that said that you were just assuming it in prior papers. But I have not found any discussion about why exactly, as a legal matter, that pro rata across the board discussion must be so. And the simple answer is that there is no law that tells the president what he or she has to do in the face of Social Security insolvency. It's in some way we're entering no man's land, uncharted territory. At OLC, at the Department of Justice, where I worked, the Office of Legal Counsel, we would often call this take care land, named after the constitutional clause providing that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Which is, in other words, you've got to do your best in an impossible situation. Good luck. And so a simple illustration of kind of what I view as the president's take care obligations in an impossible situation is, what if Congress directs the executive branch to build 10 bridges and appropriates X amount of dollars to build for that project? But say X amount of dollars is only sufficient to build 9 bridges. No one would think that the president would have to build 90% of each bridge, rendering it pointless. Making everything non-functional. You could instead prioritize the 9 most important bridges and say, well, I'll put off that 10th bridge that's the least important until we get the money, Congress. This simple principle is pretty well established. So first, the Government Accountability Office authors a treatise on federal appropriations law. And I will quote, forgive me, I'm going to just directly quote so you don't think I'm making up any situation, particularly since I'm going against decades of received conventional wisdom. The GAO in that treatise asked the question, what is an agency to do when it finds that it does not have enough money to accommodate an entire class of beneficiaries? The treatise says, if an agency cannot get additional funding and the program legislation fails to provide guidance, the agency may, within its discretion, establish reasonable classifications, priorities, and/or eligibility requirements, as long as it does so on a rational and consistent basis. That point, part of the GAO treatise, is consistent with Supreme Court precedent, and specifically a case of Morton v. Ruiz in 1974. That case considered how the Bureau of Indian Affairs could manage a program for which Congress made more Indians legally eligible for benefits than it allocated funds to provide them. The court stated that the secretary was authorized to create reasonable classifications and eligibility requirements in order to allocate the limited funds. And if only enough funds were appropriated for 10,000 needy Indian beneficiaries and the entire class of eligible beneficiaries numbered 20,000, it would be incumbent upon the BIA to develop an eligibility standard, and that standard might leave some of the class otherwise encompassed by the appropriation without benefits. The key that the Supreme Court said is that the agency make the standard known and it's applied consistently, so as to avoid sort of appearance of unfairness. And the DC Circuit has also echoed this. So my takeaway is that the president actually has wide discretion to triage the situation if we are faced with Social Security insolvency. It could be a pro rata across the board, reduction like everyone assumes. But you could also have a reasonable prioritization of benefits. For example, you could target cuts at younger retirees. The president could choose to, on the theory that younger retirees can still work and don't need that income. You can target cuts at wealthier retirees to preserve the core anti-poverty purpose of the Social Security program, as long as it appears like a reasonable, non-arbitrary classification, and the president is taking care to make sure that they're doing the best to fulfill the core purpose of the program in an impossible situation. It is something that is within the president's discretion to do. So one final point before I turn this over to Andrew is, I often think about, as well as I get asked the question, how could we all be so wrong? Like Kristen, by the way, like no one actually, you look at everything and everyone assumes a pro rata reduction. And I do admit it gives me pause to contradict basically everyone. But I think the simple answer is that very few people have actually thought, if any, deeply about the legal implications of insolvency. Most people simply assume the answer. And I find this situation very similar to my work on the statutory debt limit. So law professor Connor Clark and I were nervous. We published a Wall Street Journal op-ed during the last debt limit crisis that said actually after the debt limit is reached, the president could timely pay all debt service obligations and interest and important benefits like Social Security. They could prioritize certain statutory payments. We expected, if no one essentially emailed us to tell us we're wrong. Just no comments. No comments to suggest we're wrong. It's been years now. So I feel pretty confident in that prediction, and I feel pretty confident in this prediction. Although obviously I think this is an area that lawyers need to think about more. So Andrew has, I can only discuss the legal implications of this. And one question that was always in the back of my mind is, well, does this matter? Is there actually a feasible plan that the president could put together to prioritize benefits within the dedicated revenue stream? And so that is where I turn it over to Andrew.
Well, thank you, Kristen. This paper came about in an interesting way in the sense at the time, both Chris and I were pessimistic that Congress or the next president was going to do anything to fix Social Security. So the idea of what do we do when the trust fund runs out has become a much more salient issue than it would have been when we were more confident in the governance of our officials. At the time, Kristen had sort of the legal theory. Well, what I was thinking of is, okay, when the trust fund runs out, what should be an opening bid on Social Security reform? If you're somebody like me who is a fiscal conservative, you're going to have negotiations, what do you go in with? What we realized in comparing notes is that a president, what I saw as my opening bid, is something the president could actually do and say, this is the starting point. If the trust fund becomes insolvent, this is where we're going to start in terms of the allocation of benefits. What we've concluded is the president could instruct the Social Security Commissioner to adjust benefits in the case of the trust fund insolvency. What the president would be limited. The president could not unilaterally raise taxes to produce more revenues. The president also could not pay people, or I believe could not pay people more than they are entitled to under the Social Security benefit formula. For instance, I favor a flat benefit, a strong minimum benefit. That's not something the president could do. However, the president, provided this were done in a reasonable and non-arbitrary way, could reallocate how that 21% benefit cut were borne by retirees. The idea that we're putting forward here is that were the trust fund to become insolvent, the president would propose a cap on monthly benefits for the old age and survivors program. The cap, this is a calibrated number, but it would be set at approximately $2,050 per month in 2024 dollars. Any retiree entitled to receive less than $2,050 per month would receive their full scheduled benefit, but anybody entitled to a benefit greater than $2,050 per month would receive $2,050 per month. And again, this is a calculation of projecting forward to 23, the distribution of old age and survivors benefits, and saying what capped benefit would reduce total benefits by 21%. And that $2,050 per month, by my calculations, would be sufficient to do that. And this gives a different, Kristen referenced a paper I did in 2004 when I was at the Social Security Administration saying, what would happen to retirees if the trust fund went insolvent? We had this across-the-board benefit cut. At that time, we projected that the elderly poverty rate would double. Even middle-class retirees would have significant hit to their benefits. This proposal of capping benefits at a little over $2,000 per month has a much more a favorable outcome for retirees. Approximately 52% of retirees would receive their full scheduled benefit. Approximately 80% of seniors would receive a higher benefit than they would have under this 21% across-the-board benefit cut. No retiree would be pushed into poverty as a result of these benefit adjustments. In fact, if you had a couple who were each receiving the maximum, that capped benefit per month, they would be at 2.7 times the elderly poverty threshold before they drew on a penny of their other savings. But the downside is that money has to come from somewhere. The highest income retirees would receive a benefit of around 50% because they are receiving roughly twice as much as that $2,000 level. At the same time, though, for those highest income retirees, Social Security is a relatively small portion of their total income. So their total incomes would decline by much, much less than that. Partly the way I think about this is thinking about how it might shape the reform, the debate, which would inevitably happen. What we are proposing is not a permanent solution to the Social Security funding problem, but a starting point that averts a crisis. The way I tend to look at this, and this reflects my views, which are different from sort of the legal analysis, but my own point of view is that when we are facing this significant long-term budgetary gap, Congress should allocate public resources to clear public purposes. Now, 2033 is the date when the Social Security Retirement Trust Fund is projected to be insolvent. By coincidence, it also happens to be the year in which a high-income couple with their two combined benefits would be entitled to more than $100,000 in annual Social Security benefits measured in today's dollars. So I'm not having inflation do the work for me. So when you think about the juxtaposition of these 2 points, the question is, when we are facing significant budget constraints, should we in fact be paying $100,000 a year in Social Security benefits to couples who have adequate resources on their own? Now, a 21% benefit cut would in fact cause what we might call a retirement crisis. Poverty would be increased dramatically. And given the limited capacity of Congress to work in a nuanced way, I suspect their inclination might be, well, let's just simply continue to borrow the money to pay full benefits for everyone. Let's raise taxes to pay full benefits for everyone, including those households that are receiving $100,000 per year. Again, in my view as a fiscal conservative, there are other uses for that money. So this is a proposal that the president could announce ahead of time. Say a year prior to trust fund insolvency, he could put Congress on warning and say, if you allow the trust fund to go insolvent, this is what's going to happen. We're not going to have a retirement crisis where the poverty rate doubles. We're going to protect the bottom half of the income distribution completely. We're going to have modest benefit cuts on top of that, but we're going to have significant benefit cuts for people at the top. And the importance of this, I think, is that it actually mirrors reasonably well what Americans and what both political parties actually agree on. There are very few people in Congress today who say we want to have significant benefit cuts for lower income Americans. In fact, most of the proposals out there would increase benefits to some degree for the lowest income Americans to improve the safety net. This proposal, which protects low and most middle-income Americans, focuses the policy decisions on what I think is most salient, which then the question there is, how much do we want to increase taxes, probably on middle and upper-income households, to provide higher Social Security benefits, mostly to middle and upper income households, at a time, as John Cogan pointed out, where the data indicate that middle and upper income retirees in the United States are doing extremely well financially. So it's something that both prevents a crisis in the event of solvency, of trust fund insolvency, but also pushes the debate in what I think is a more productive direction. So we'll stop at that and obviously open any questions.
I've got one, or those three. benefit of the audience, just for context, both Andrew and I had the pleasure of serving as Deputy Commissioner of Social Security, which is the #2 position, and also being the Secretary to the Board of Trustees for these reports that we're talking about. And I think partly, Kristen, to your point about why this hasn't come in conversation, is one, there might be an assumption that Congress would do something before trust fund depletion, or two, that there would be some borrowed funds by Congress. We might not actually get across that cliff. And I think your proposal you're talking about does push the debate a little bit. But when I was at Social Security, we were talking about what would happen. And of course, you can always find a lawyer to tell you anything you want them to tell you. And I should preface, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV. But our general counsel would tell us that the commissioner had two options. One is to reduce benefits for everybody. Otherwise, you're making potentially an arbitrary and capricious determination of who gets a cut, because you wouldn't necessarily know their other income sources, Andrew. So they could be a high earner, but maybe they went away and blew all their excise money on something else, and they were going to rely on Social Security, and this 50% cut does put them into a lower income than they would otherwise be used to. So you couldn't make that decision. But you could cut benefits, or you could delay payment until such time as the trust fund had a little bit more money in to make full benefits. Now, that would still end up being a cut over the course of a year, because all you're doing is delaying a payment, and so it'd still be a cut. But that was sort of the understanding that we had at Social Security, is that you had one of those two options, unless Congress did something. So the president really didn't have any authority. The commissioner could do one of two things, couldn't make anything. So I guess my question for you is, you sort of gave some legal background about why you think the president might have some discretion. I think politically it wouldn't happen, because I think the commissioner wouldn't want to get sued and would just say, look, I can only pay out what I get in, or I'm going to delay, which is probably most likely what I think a commissioner would do. But how do you avoid having someone, again, sue the commissioner of Social Security and saying, you just made an arbitrary, capricious decision. You said, we're making regional differences, we've made some sort of category and adjustments, we put it out in public, but you don't have any other context about who then deserves or doesn't deserve it or needs it, and hence it wouldn't be constitutional.
Could I just touch on that quickly
Oh,
before
sure.
you give a much more knowledgeable legal answer? And I remember when I was at Social Security, having those discussions with the general counsel there. And I think and these were probably separate discussions, but at the time, I think the general counsel's focus was much more on the first piece of conventional wisdom that Kristen outlined, that benefits must indeed be cut to the level that's affordable given appropriate or allocated resources, and they certainly agreed on that. I think they probably paid much less attention to whether the commissioner or the president would have the authority to do something other than across-the-board benefit cut. As I recall, they just didn't pay much attention to it. But I think to go to your point of whether something like what we outlined would be arbitrary, I think you would want to think of it in the context of how the Social Security program works today. Social Security is not a means-tested program. It pays benefits out to people in different states with different costs of living using one benefit formula. So I don't think it would be arbitrary to make changes to that benefit formula with, I think, a clear insight to reducing any impact on poverty. On top of that, if you were to say we were going to calibrate these benefit cuts based on your other resources, that's an incredibly resource-intensive thing to do, because we have no capacity in the Social Security Administration today to do that kind of work. It's not a means-tested program. So I think if you were making the argument, we need to do something on short notice that is consistent with how the program works, that is non-arbitrary and reasonable, I think what we've outlined would probably pass that test. That doesn't mean they won't get sued, but it
So that actually dovetails with my answer too, is Social Security is getting sued. Like if there's insolvency, someone and anyone's benefits are cut, they're going to sue. It's just, I think that's inevitable. And that's because a pro rata reduction, an across the board reduction, is also a decision by the commissioner. Just as a choice, just as much as, say, instead of doing a across the board cut, doing a cap instead. Like those are both choices by the commissioner, subject to arbitrary and capricious attack. I actually feel like in some ways the stronger case for arbitrary and capricious would be a pro rata cut, because you know that there are retirees in the bottom percentile. I'm just statistically significantly more likely that someone who's getting $1,000, Social Security month benefit is going to be at a harder situation. So I think as long as the Social Security Administration considers the alternatives and provides a reasoned explanation for why they have chosen one course or the other, and why this is preserving the core purpose of the program, I think it will ultimately be upheld. But either way, they're going to get sued.
Go ahead, John.
So I'm not a political scientist, but say your plan, if the system's insolvent, becomes the base, that's what we're going to do, and that's put to a vote in Congress versus using general revenues, leaving benefits alone, leaving payroll taxes alone, just going to these general revenues. Do you think that that up or down vote, which way would it go? I tend to think they would go with the general revenues. I'm not saying they should, but I think that they would.
That's possible. And to be honest, that was something, when I look at this and I say, okay, we'd have two presidential candidates today, both of whom have promised not to cut benefits for anyone at any time, neither of which have proposed tax increases sufficient to keep that promise. You say, what's the residual? And that's debt. And so it is not outside the possibility that that's what would happen, because I think lacking something like this, that's the most likely outcome. They'll simply borrow the money. This, I think, and I think that would be a fiscally irresponsible thing to do. It's not that we're not borrowing the money today, we are, but I think if you're at trust fund insolvency and you say our solution to Social Security going forward is to borrow amounts that we have no real plan for repaying. It's one thing, I think, to have an unsustainable budget baseline. It's another thing to say our policy is an unsustainable budget baseline. If I were, holders of Treasury debt at that point, I would start rethinking things, because at that point there'd be no plan to get on top of these things. So I think this is something that could bias it a little bit away from that, in the sense that the people who are most vulnerable, who are most sympathetic, would already be protected. And then you're thinking, do we want to borrow an extra $400 billion a year to protect people who are already the richest retirees on earth? And I'm not saying you shouldn't protect any of them, but this is something that really, these sort of nightmare scenarios that people have of what would happen if Social Security ran out, this prevents those. And so I think it gets you back to a more reasonable discussion. Now, just because you're having a reasonable discussion doesn't mean you'll get a reasonable answer, but it's a reasonable discussion.
I would say even as to the wealthiest retirees, who theoretically, there are probably some that don't have any alternate savings, as you alluded to. And so, but, they would still receive the benefit cap. And so even they would not fall into poverty as a result of the benefit cut.
So just your point, John, I don't disagree with you that if a vote among the two were held, but I think what you guys are doing is needed, setting up a sort of a bar that has to be overcome. And it sets the stage for a debate that has to say something's got to be done better than this.
You're voting, exactly, you're not voting on one versus the other. If this were implemented, you are then voting on the increment, which is how much additional borrowing do we want, how much additional taxes do we want to pay additional benefits to these middle income and upper income retirees. So it is taking the nightmare scenario of the low income retirees off the table and saying we're reallocating available resources to what I think is the strongest public purpose for a Social Security program, and then saying at the margin, how much do we value additional benefits for people on top of that? I mean, even at the middle, with these cuts, people will be receiving well more in Social Security benefits here under Social Security than they would be receiving if they were in Canada or Australia or the United Kingdom, et cetera. So it's trying to have a more rational discussion at the margin of what we're willing to pay and what we value.
What could happen, though, is that Social Security being kind of with its own tax base and its own benefit formula, if they go to general revenues, that's all kind of gone. But I can certainly, liberals, Democrats would rather raise the corporate tax than the payroll tax. You go to general revenues, you can tax rich people. I'm not sure that Social Security is going to be maintained as a separate entity.
Andrew, under your current plan, we've had the cap you've outlined. What percentage of beneficiaries would see at least $1 reduction in their benefits? Is it half?
About 48%. So we
half.
think 52% approximately would be protected.
And for the low, like those at the 52nd percentile, it
Yeah,
would
it's
be
like
incredibly
it's
modest.
off.
And,
Yeah, it's just that's.
Yeah, about 80% of people on my projections would receive a lower benefit cut than under this 21% across the board cut baseline. So if you're just thinking of people voting their self-interest, 80% of people would prefer this, which doesn't make it better policy, but I think it makes it a more attractive alternative, both politically but also in substance of what we're trying to do with this program.
I think you,
Get John and then go.
So, Kristen, your idea is, to me, extraordinary.
Thank you.
It's really
I
extraordinary.
hope in a good way.
It's unbelievable.
It is it would involve an enormous transfer of power to the executive branch, right? If there's no limiting principle to what the president can do other than not being arbitrary and capricious. Is that right or not?
Here is the limiting. I would say no, and I'm actually someone who's very concerned about separation of powers and preserving congressional authority. I've worked on the Hill. No, the limiting principle here is this only exists in insolvency. There has to be the appropriation has to run dry. The president has to be facing an impossible situation where the Congress has said give people this amount of benefits, but do it with this amount of money, which is not enough.
It applies to any entitlement program in the United States government where the underlying statute says shall pay. That is, the government shall pay, because that's the language of Social Security. It really kind of makes an entitlement. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it is an enormous transfer. It would be an enormous transfer of power. And the president would be allowed, am I correct, that to increase the retirement age, for example, as a solution.
As long as that were considered a reasonable, non-arbitrary, response to basically triaging an impossible situation, yes.
So right now, the way our system works is the president proposes and Congress disposes. And here, now we would add something. If the Congress fails to provide a sufficient appropriation, the president gets to change the underlying law, and then Congress has to respond to the change in the underlying law.
So I would say I would not call it a change in the law. The president has no authority to change the law. But the president,
Sort of the eligibility.
what Congress has done, asked of the president, is legally impossible.
Right.
And those situations are actually pretty rare. That's why you don't see too many Supreme Court cases, too many examples in the past, like where Congress has, and so I think while it is certainly something with respect to Social Security that has enormous economic implications, it is in general a legal theory that is cabined by the president being faced with an impossible situation, which happens relatively rarely.
Right. One other point, I guess. The liability, if Congress doesn't act, the underlying liability, if I understood you right, continues. And so eventually when Congress gets around, let's say in 2037 or whenever, to fixing the problem, there's going to be an enormous pressure to make people whole for their loss of benefits.
I think it would probably be fiscally, Social Security reform is in and of itself, to get it solvent on an ongoing basis is very difficult. So I think if you're factoring in past payments, that would be almost impossible. And it would be within Congress's authority to basically say, we're going to appropriate additional funds, we're going to increase taxes, whatever, but this is only going to pay for prospective benefits. So I do not think Congress, as a legal matter, would be constrained. They could basically extinguish the past statutory entitlement.
Yes, I agree they
Yeah.
could. But when the government shuts down and civil servants go without pay for a temporary period, when the appropriations are finally provided, they always end up making the Social
It could. Imagine if there's a government, usually shutdowns last at most a month or so, often less. I think in a situation, so if you have insolvency that only lasts for a few weeks because Congress is still negotiating, yeah, Congress probably does make retirees whole. If you're operating under this kind of baseline for a year 2 years, 3 years, it probably becomes such an enormous that it just would be an impediment to reform, and they would say we're only going to do this going forward. My guess. That's really a political.
You've opened up one more thing. You've opened up a phenomenal research opportunity for a lot of political scientists.
Gopi, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I don't disagree with you that if we're thinking about benefit reductions, then protecting the lower income people makes sense. But one criticism of this might be that the tie between contributions and benefits that are accrued, which is already quite weak for higher income people, especially towards the end of their career, becomes even weaker, or actually just a pure tax at that point. What would your response to that be?
Well, I think, and this goes to John's previous discussion, is whatever legislation emerges. The idea is when this has been greeted in some way from some people saying, well, this is your final solution for Social Security. This is just what you think reform should be, which is not the case. Whenever legislation came about, it would moot this in the sense that if Congress said we want to pay higher benefits and we're willing to allocate the resources for it, then that's fine. At the same time, it doesn't bother me that much to break that link at the high end. Again, I referenced pension systems in other countries that cap at much lower levels than we do. I mean, it's the maximum Social Security benefit is 2 to 3 times higher than in other Anglo countries. So and they have not collapsed as a result of that. And at the same time, the other proposals that are on the table also would weaken or sever the link. Proposals to say lift the taxable maximum wage. Sure, they'll sometimes say we'll replace 2% of those final earnings, but that's simply a fig leaf. For all intents and purposes, they're imposing a pure tax on people. So I do think when you have a program like this, which is underfunded by $25 trillion, somebody is going to take a hit. It is most likely going to be high income retirees. But let me just make one final economic point. If you're going to break that link and you're going to hit people with it, it is much better to renege on their benefits than it is essentially to raise their taxes. In the sense, if you're raising their tax rates and so you're now paying twice as much to get an additional dollar of benefits, well, okay, that weakens your incentives going forward. If you instead you were to say, okay, hey, high income retirees, we're cutting your benefits by some percentage, that's a sort of a negative income effect. And that would induce them to work longer. And I think if you look back, John talked about this double indexing issue you had with Social Security in the 70s. And when they rolled that back, the Social Security Administration researchers have looked at how retirees responded to this called the so-called Social Security notch, how they responded to that cut in their benefits. Those retirees, or they were then older workers who were disadvantaged by that, made up the vast majority of the difference by working longer. So I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm saying, but if you're going to hit people, and you are going to hit people, it does depend on how you go about doing it. And I don't think this is the worst way, I'll say that.
We're having a great discussion. We're going to take a 5-minute break now, and we'll be back at 11:05 for the final session and then Q&A from the audience.
All right.
Great. Thank you.